What is up, my fellow knife making friends? Today I have a very special video for you because it is all about making a brand new knife that's not supposed to look brand new. This is also an experimental knife in that I've tried a couple of things during this build that I've never done before, and I got quite an interesting look out of the blade. So with that being said, sit back, relax, and let's get busy! Alright, enough with that. Let's trace out the design and transfer it onto a piece of steel. Alright, so transferring the design onto the steel, one thing that I used to do that I don't do anymore is use spray tack to hold my paper design onto my flat piece of steel, and I stopped doing that because I noticed that the spray tack was clogging up my belts, and it's really difficult to get out of the belts, and it almost ruins the belt because there's not really a good way to clean the spray tack off of the belts once it becomes embedded into the belt. So I moved on and started using a Sharpening to just trace out the design onto the steel and onto the angle grinder to grind out the design. Nothing special here, everybody's seen this before. And just kind of cleaning up the design on my belt sander and on a squared up work rest on my other belt sander that I use for grinding bevels. Next, I'll take a Sharpie and color in the bevel area of the knife. That way I can scribe a line with a pair of calipers right down the center, and that is my grind line. That's the line that I'm going to be grinding to. One thing that I hear all the time from people is that you're not supposed to use calipers to scribe lines in that manner, and that's not necessarily true. A lot of times these calipers will come with hardened tips on them, specifically for scribing lines in softer steel. So it can be done and it won't ruin your calipers. And then it's on to grinding the bevels. This actually took quite a long time to grind the bevels on this knife. It took, I want to say, around an hour to grind both sides of the knife. This is the 4x36 inch belt sander, and the thing's actually kind of crapping out on me. I have one of the bearings going out and one of the idler wheels. The work rest won't stay square anymore, and I'm kind of getting as much as I possibly can out of it before I end up trashing it. So I will be getting a new grinder here hopefully soon, and I won't have to mess around with this old 4x36 anymore. The belts that I'm using are ceramic belts. The ceramic belts work okay on 4x36s. What I have found is that the very coarse grits, I want to say below 80 grit, don't work super well on this 4x36. It just doesn't have the power to turn those super heavy grits. 80 grit to 120 grit is probably where you're going to want to stay if you're using a 4x36. But I have noticed that the ceramic belts last significantly longer than any other style of belt. Next, it's on to filing the sharpening choil or the Spanish notch, whatever you want to call it. I'm using chainsaw files here. I really like chainsaw files because they're consistent width all the way down the entire length of the file. They don't taper in any way. Chainsaw files are really nice for knife making if you have to file any kind of notch or anything like that. And then on to marking out the pinholes and the lanyard tube locations. I usually just kind of guess at these. I just space them evenly down the handle and just place the lanyard tube kind of off center there at the bottom, and it usually works out pretty fine. And then I forgot to hit the record button when drilling out all of the holes, but basically I drilled the holes using a 1/4 inch drill bit for the pins and a 5/16 inch drill bit for the lanyard tube. And then just using a cheap countersink bit to countersink all the holes and clean everything up. Then on to 220 grit sandpaper to put a nice consistent even finish on the entire knife. And now it's on to the heat treating cycles. So I ended up doing 3 normalization cycles on this blade. I'm only going to show one because it's all the same. Basically, you heat the knife up to 1500 degrees, pull it out and let it cool in still air. I did that 3 times, and then I went on to the quench cycle. So I decided to do an edge quench on this blade, and there you see me just kind of pouring my canola oil into a spackle pan that I had sealed up all the corners to. Heated the knife up like I normally do to non-magnetic, and then maybe 30 to 40 seconds longer in the heat, and then put the edge into the quench oil. There's really not much to it. It's kind of self-explanatory. You do have to watch for flare-ups as there's still hot pieces of the knife out of the oil and can easily light the fumes. But if done right, you can get a nice hardened edge and a soft spine. And this knife skates a file no problem whatsoever, and it's actually probably one of the better heat treatments that I've ever done. So after the quench, you want to temper the knife immediately or as soon as possible. I actually forgot to record the temper cycle. Basically, I had the camera set up and forgot to hit the record button. Anyway, what it entails is putting the knife in the center rack of my kitchen oven, set at 400 degrees, and I did 2 1-hour cycles at 400 degrees, allowing the knife to cool to room temperature between each cycle. And it's pretty much that simple. So now it's the next day, and here I am just kind of cleaning up the bevels with a 120 grit ceramic belt, being very careful to keep the blade cool because I don't want to ruin my temper. And then I just go back and put another nice even 220 grit finish on all of the flats. Once that is done, I go back to the grinder and grind in my secondary bevel. This is actually the sharpened portion of the knife, and I'm doing this with, again, 120 grit belt, and then I move on to a 220 grit belt. And then I'll do the final sharpening after the entire knife is complete. So now it's time for the experimental portion of the build. This is actually a vinegar soak. I decided to soak the knife in vinegar overnight to see what kind of patina I could get on, or what kind of finish that I could get on the knife. But while that's soaking, I decided to work on the scales. I'm just using hickory for my scale material and G10 for liner material. I started out with a relatively thick piece of hickory and just took the width down on the belt sander. This is a 50 grit Diablo belt from Home Depot. One thing to note is that the ceramic belts do not work for wood. They will remove a little bit of wood material, but you have a better chance of actually burning the wood with the ceramic belts than doing any sort of sanding with it. So you have to get a belt that's designed for removing wood. Ceramic belts won't work. And there you see me cutting the G10 for the liner material. It's just regular old orange G10, nothing special. And here I'm just kind of roughing up both sides of the liner with an 80 grit sanding disc. You just want to make sure that your liners are completely roughed up before you glue them together, otherwise the glue won't stick. Speaking of glue, I normally use super glue to glue liners to scale material, but since I'm using natural wood in this case, I decided to use G-Flex for the liners to the scales. Main reason is because G-Flex tends to soak into the wood material a little bit better than super glue does. I've done some experimenting with this and find that the super glue tends to dry on the surface, even though it's still a very strong bond. But the G-Flex seems to have a stronger bond when you're working with a natural wood because it actually soaks into the wood fibers itself. Whereas super glue dries so fast that it doesn't really have time to soak into anything. This is just based off of my own experimenting and weather conditions, which has a lot to do with it. So do your own experimenting when it comes to what glue works best for your liners and scales and all that good stuff. So here's what the blade looks like fresh out of a 24-hour soak in vinegar, and it's actually kind of a surprising look. The vinegar seemed like it ate away a lot of the softer metal. And I'm actually surprised that it ate away as much as it did. And you can see those horizontal lines in the steel there. They were not there before the vinegar soak. Those are actually, I guess, etched lines into the steel from the vinegar. It's kind of amazing how well the vinegar soak worked. I didn't expect it to work that well. It did end up putting a nice patina on the blade. It really does add a sort of worn and weathered look to the blade. So here I'm just squaring up my scale material on the belt sander. And then on to cutting the pins with an angle grinder. These are just stainless pins. One thing that I would probably change is I don't think I'd use stainless in this if I was to do it again. I think I'd go back and use copper or brass pins instead. But it's too late to change now. And just roughing up the pins in the drill press with 80 grit sandpaper. And then finally on to drilling my scale materials. One thing that you definitely want to do if you decide to drill all of your scale material at the same time is make sure that your liners are facing each other when you go and drill the holes. If your liners aren't facing each other, your holes will not line up when you decide to put them on either side of the knife. Then we'll just mark everything and cut it down the length and start shaping the front portion of the scales. You've got to do this before you glue everything together because you can't shape this portion after you epoxy it onto the knife. And for this knife, I decided to do most of the handle shaping before I epoxied everything together. This is kind of nice, and it's also kind of risky because if your scales end up breaking or something like that, you end up wasting a bunch of time. Having them glued to the knife really helps stabilize everything and keep everything in place. Just be careful when you go to hammer your pins in when you do finally glue everything together, because cracking scales in half after you spent a lot of time shaping them is a terrible thing. Not much to say about handle shaping. It's one of those things where you kind of get better at it as you do it, just like everything else. I kind of use a combination between my belt sander and just doing it freehand or sanding freehand to get the shape that I want. I very rarely mark things out and just kind of eyeball everything. A lot of it is based upon feel, how the knife feels in my hand as I'm shaping it. One thing that I kind of regret not doing on this blade is leaving the handle kind of an octagonal shape. Leaving it kind of multifaceted like you see there rather than rounding everything off. Octagonal shape handles really have a unique feel to them, and they really have a unique look to them. I mean, I think it would have set this knife apart, but I decided to just kind of round everything off like any other knife handle, and I'm not real sure why. It's just one of those things that I just got to sanding and kept on sanding. Now here I'm drilling a bunch of holes through the liner material and into the wood. The idea behind this is that the epoxy will kind of flow through those holes and bond to the wood, and then through the liner, and then through the knife, and then onto the other side of the other liner. This theoretically allows for a stronger bond between everything. I'm not really sure if it's super necessary, but it's just one of those extra steps that you do just to do it. And then on to epoxying everything together. I'm using G-Flex here, nothing special, just applying it to all the surfaces and putting all those surfaces together. It's funny, I got a comment the other day on one of my other videos where I was epoxying everything together and someone had said that my handle was going to fail or come apart because I mixed my epoxy in incorrect ratios. Now the epoxy here, this is the same epoxy that I'm using in the other video, and it's supposed to be mixed 50-50, and apparently this person could tell that my mixture was incorrect through the video, even as the video is speeding along at 20 times its normal playback rate. The funny thing is that if my handle scales do fall off, I'll just glue them back on. So now we'll clamp everything together and allow it to sit and set up overnight. 24 hours later, we'll remove the clamps and inspect the blade, making sure that we wiped off all of the excess epoxy and look at all of our mistakes that we made the day before, because now it's absolutely too late to do anything about it. But no matter, we'll go on to finish shaping the handle and removing all of the excess epoxy and taking our pins down. We got to be careful here not to overheat the wood, which doesn't really matter anyway because we'll end up putting a burned finish on this to give it kind of an older, dirty look. So if you're into that sort of thing, that's the kind of look we're going for. It is really nice having most of the handle shaping already done at this point. Just, again, kind of cleaning everything up, giving everything that final touch. Then on to the buffing wheel to give the blade portion a quick buffing. And this is just to remove any dirt or excess kind of weird stuff that will be hanging around on the blade. You definitely don't want weird stuff hanging around on your blade. You definitely don't want to go too crazy here with the buffing wheel, or you'll end up removing all of the patina back down to bare metal again. You'll have to start all over, which at this point we can't really do anyway. And then for finishing the handle, I am using teak oil. I will be doing several coats of this over the course of the next several days. But for now, just one coat, let it soak, and then wipe off the excess. And then a quick stropping on the DIY green compound strop. Again, this is just a 220 grit grinder edge, and it slices phone book paper with relative ease. So I wasn't real happy with the way the handle looked. It looked too clean and perfect for this knife, and I needed to dirty it up a little bit. So out came the blowtorch for a burned finish. I usually don't like this type of finish on wood, but I think it fits this knife perfectly. If you're gonna do this type of finish on your knife, be very careful how hot you get the scales. You can easily compromise the epoxy bond by getting it too hot. If there's one rule to knife making, it's don't get things too hot. So this wraps up another awesome build video. If you like this video, please hit the like button. If you're not subscribed, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any more completely crazy awesome build videos like this one. As always, leave your questions and comments down below. I try to read and respond to as many comments as I can, and I really like hearing from you guys. Again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.